I want to welcome you all to the October RWG meeting. Today, we're going to be going over medical device needs and requirements. Our presenter is Lou Wheatcraft. Lou's a senior consultant and managing member of Wheatland Consulting. He's an international expert in system engineering, focusing on needs and requirements development, management of those needs and requirements, verification, validation across the life cycle. His goal is to ensure and help system engineers practice better system engineering from a needs and requirements perspective across the lifecycle stages from system and product development. He believes that getting the needs and requirements right up front is key to a successful project. Lou has over 50 years of experience in system engineering. That includes 22 years in the United States Air Force. He's taught over 200 requirement seminars over the past 24 years. He supports clients from many industries, from government to medical, to aerospace, defense, consumer goods, transportation, and energy. Lou's been an active member of INCOSE over the last 24 years and a member of the RWG and is currently the chair of the RWG. He's a principal author on a variety of the RWG products. Lou has a BS degree in electrical engineering from Oklahoma State University, a MA degree in computer information systems, MS degree in environmental management, and completed coursework for a degree in studies of the future. To you, Lou.
Welcome, everyone. We have a lot of members of the requirement working group that are involved in medical device development, and I've had quite a few clients involved in developing medical devices. They've had me come in and help them with their product requirements. This presentation is going to focus on requirements from a system engineering perspective. One of our main products is the Needs and Requirements Manual. It was first released in January 2022, and then we updated it in May. And the contents aligns with and expands the INCOSE System Engineering Handbook, version 5 material. And there's several different sections in the System Engineering Handbook that refer to the Needs and Requirements Manual for more elaboration on key activities involved with a given process area. And the NRM is updated to version 2 and is going to be published by Wiley within the next month. And you can see the cover on the right. Supporting this is the Guide to Needs and Requirements, the Guide to Writing Requirements, Guide to Verification and Validation. And we also have domain-specific guides that have been developed and are being developed. Jeff Williams is one of our co-chairs, is developing a guide to model-based needs and requirements. System Security Group had released a guide to system security needs and requirements. And there's plans for a guide to system needs and requirements. And we'll have other associated guides as well. All of our products received this Product of the Year award for all the work that we're doing with the various products that we produce. This presentation is really taken from the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations, Title 21, Part 820, and also the International Standard ISO 13485. Both these documents really focus on requirements for regulatory purposes that outline the current good manufacturing practice requirements for medical device manufacturers. And these regulation standards cover the methods, facilities, and controls used for design, manufacture, packaging, labeling, storage, installation, and servicing of all finished medical devices intended for human use. However, as the title implies, the focus is more on quality as in quality management system than on systems engineering as presented by INCOSE and requirement working group products. You'll see that the requirements in these standards are mostly requirements on the organization. The organization shall do this, the organization shall do that. But hidden within CFR Title 21, Part 820, and the International Standard ISO 13485 is a product development process, high level. But they don't go into a whole lot of details in defining that. In this presentation, the concepts, terminology, and requirements contained in the regulation standard, we're going to integrate those with the concept, activities, and terminology contained in the INCOSE RWG products. At the end of the presentation, we'll talk about the fact that we're in planning stages to develop a guide to medical device needs and requirements that implement what's in this regulation. Because a lot of the work that I've done with the medical devices, there are key concepts I think apply to all products, not just medical devices. So you'll see many of the concept and terminology that's contained in these regulations are also reflected in the INCOSE requirement working group products. design inputs versus design outputs. So there's a lot of definitions that are included in Title 21, Part 820, as well as the ISO standard. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but my point is that they don't actually have definitions for what needs and requirements are. They refer to the needs and requirements, but they don't define what they are. So because of this, in this presentation, I'm using the INCOSE definitions from the Guide to Writing Requirements. It is interesting in 13485, they do indicate that the use of shall indicates a statement is a requirement. And when a requirement is to be documented, it also is required to be established, implemented, maintained. So we're going to apply that to product requirements in addition to the organizational requirements on the organization. Not all the requirements in these standards apply to the organization, not to the actual product itself. Get into this definition of needs. As a need statement is a result of a formal transformation of one or more sources or lifecycle concepts into an agreed to expectation for an entity to perform some function and present some quality within specified constraints with acceptable risk. Key to the definition is the formal transformation. So we have a lot of inputs into the process. We have stakeholder needs and requirements and their expectations. And there's a whole lot of other stuff I'll show you later that are inputs. And then that part of the transformation is a lot of analysis that takes place. And then out of that, then we're going to have an agreed to expectations for what the stakeholders expect from the system. We talk about a need set as a structured set of agreed to need expressions for the entity. And then we talk about attributes. This is additional information associated with an entity, which is used to aid in this definition of understanding management. And so we have the concept of the need expression is the need statement along with a set of associated attributes. And then requirements has a similar definition. Requirement statement is the result of a formal transformation of one or more sources, needs, or higher level requirements into an agreed to obligation for an entity to perform some function and possess some quality within specified constraints with acceptable risk. Again, the formal transformation piece that implies a detailed analysis and then the agreed to aspect of the requirements. And a requirement set then is a structured set of these requirement expressions. And then the requirement expression, like the need, is the requirement statement, the shell statement, and a set of associated attributes. So when we talk about attributes for need and requirement statement, in the need and requirements manual, chapter 15 goes through these in detail, but they're used to better manage your project. There's certain key things that you'd want, like it'd be nice if for every need or requirement you have rationale and you have a trace to its parent or source. We advocate that right up front when you're defining needs and requirements that you think ahead of verification validation. What's the success criteria, the strategy, the method, who's responsible for doing this? And then there's other attributes that are really important that can help you. There's a lot of attributes. It takes time and effort to maintain these attributes. The NRM gives a lot of guidance for the use of attributes within the organization and the whole concept that it does take time and effort. So organizations need to say which ones add the most value and help me better manage my project. And I'm going to use those. Some key ones from an FDA standpoint is A37 risk and mitigation. So there's ISO standards for risk management and risk is associated with a medical device. The FDA expects those to be identified, and then they want to see traceability across the life cycle. So any requirement associated with mitigating a risk should have this attribute set. And then criticality and priority, I'll talk about a little bit later. These are very important for us to include with our requirements as well. So they help us understand the intent, contributes to the quality of our requirement statements, and provides management with important insight as to the health of their project. These attributes aren't just for the system engineers, the product developers, they're also extremely useful for project management. We talk about a lot of work that's being done before requirements, before the final design. We have an integrated multidiscipline collaborative project team that participates in the lifecycle concept analysis and maturation activities. And so you can see, I talked about the needs, the integrated set of needs here on the right. There's a whole lot that goes into defining those. Now, interesting, the main thing the FDA is really interested in is that you clearly define the intended use for the medical device, and they're really interested in the risk and then compliance to standards and regulations. But there's a higher level needs requirements, lifecycle concepts. Some people refer to those as business needs. We have existing systems we have to interact with. And you'll see later that's a big part for the FDA is that you have to take into account the macro system that your system is going to be operating within. And they go as far as saying any verification validation activities, you have to address the interactions and interfaces with that macro system as part of your verification validation. And we also have cost and schedule that we have to worry about. All of this analysis, the FDA doesn't seem to be concerned with the analysis itself, but those key inputs and then the output is what they really find important to manage. As a result of all these activities, we want to have at least one feasible set of lifecycle concepts that are identified along with risk mitigation plans, plans for compliance with standards and regulations, plans for verification, validation, and the preliminary architecture and design. And the integrated set of needs is baseline representing an agreed to scope of the project and which we're going to validate against. Now, one thing about the lifecycle concepts analysis and maturation, which is really critical for medical device companies, is with new technologies, part of this is assessing what are the critical technologies and assessing their maturity. And there's TRLs, technology readiness levels that are defined. And from a project risk standpoint, those are extremely important. And those are all defined in more detail in the needs and requirements manual. Closely aligned to that is also a thing called manufacturing readiness levels. Part of the lifecycle concept is, we got this great device, we have this new technology, but can we build it? The manufacturing system is actually another system that has to be developed concurrently with the product that we're developing. And I want to point out that Jeff Williams is on one of our co-chairs. He is leading a project to develop the guide to model-based needs and requirements. And so he's providing insight into some of the analysis that you need to do in order to have at least a feasible set of lifecycle concepts and the integrated set of needs, and then the requirements transform from those. So when we talk about the integrated set of needs, they represent an integrated stakeholder, customer, acquirer view of the system of interest. They communicate the perspective of the system as viewed externally, a black closed box perspective. You're not worried about what's inside. It's just, what do I need this thing to do? What quality do I need it to do? And so it communicates to stakeholder real world expectations for the end state once the system of interest is delivered. In the end, what will final acceptance be based on? What is needed to show the delivered system is fit for use in its operational environment when used by its intended users? The integrated set of needs must be well formed, having the characteristics defined in the guide to writing requirements. The baseline integrated set of needs represents the agreed to scope of the project. And we're going to validate the system against the integrated set of needs. And a key point is that in the past, a lot of people talk about requirements analysis and requirements elicitation, and we've broken that out. So we start with needs elicitation, needs analysis, and then part of the transformation the needs into the requirements is then where we come into requirements analysis. But the quality of our requirements is totally dependent upon the quality of the needs, which is dependent on the quality of the lifecycle analysis and maturation activities from which they were transformed. Defining the integrated set of needs, we have a lot of inputs that we have to obtain. And then from these inputs, we develop a set of lifecycle concepts. So let's say a set, because we're talking about concept for the different lifecycle stages. What's our concept for acquisition? What's our concept for design, development, for verification, for validation, for marketing, for packaging? All these concepts we need to include and address up front because they can result in requirements on our device. They can also result in requirements on the organization, our instructions for use, and so on. And then from this, then we can develop an integrated set of needs. Those needs can be on the product, the organization, or our processes. And then those are what's going to be transformed into our design input requirements. And we're always going to validate the needs against lifecycle concepts and against all the input information. At the bottom, design controls, part of the quality management system that the regulation and the ISO standards really talk about, requirements on the organization for doing these activities. So in this case, you would expect the organization to have a set of requirements for how they're going to do the lifecycle concept analysis and maturation, and also how they're going to transform those then into an integrated set of needs. Like I said, the FDA is concerned with the intended use of the product, set of needs that address that intended use, along with risk identification and management. And the focus of requirements definition, architecture, and design is be able to develop a product which can be validated to address these. So one thing at ISO 13485, they outline what a product realization planning is about. You have to first, what are the requirements for the product? You have to establish the processes, those design controls. You need to be thinking ahead for verification and validation. And then you need to be able to keep records. Where they spend a lot of requirements on record keeping and this information, there's the assumption that you have the data that you're record keeping for. And so that's what this presentation is what is all that record keeping that we need to do. So the design input requirements represent the technical developer view of the system of interest referred to as system requirements. They're a white box, open box view of the system. They're transformed from the integrated set of needs, communicate the perspective of the system as viewed by the developers. What does the system need to do to meet the needs? Express the shall statements, or for a goal, a should statement. These are inputs in the architecture and design definition processes, and the design input requirements are validated against their integrated set of needs, and both the design and realized system will be verified against the design input requirements. And again, the quality of the requirements are dependent upon the quality of the needs, which they were transformed. So one thing we're coming to a realization, when you baseline a set of requirements and you're reviewing those requirements, you should not only be reviewing the requirements for how well they're crafted, you should also be reviewing the underlying analysis from which them and the needs were derived. If the analysis activities is incomplete, you're going to have incomplete needs and requirements. So extremely important. So again, if the integrated set of needs does not have the characteristics to define the guiding requirements, neither will the design input requirements. That's one reason why, we say before you get to the requirements, there's the needs, before the needs, the lifecycle concepts, and all the gathering inputs that feed into that. So two different perspectives. The integrated set of needs talk about what do we need to do when using the system? What do we need the system to do? What quality do we need it to have? What do we need the system to comply with? Their standards and regulations. And then what external systems do need the system to interact with? And then from a design input requirements perspective, the customer developing organization saying, what does the system must do to meet those needs? So it's important that we understand both perspectives and document those. We also have to understand there's different levels of lifecycle concept needs and requirements that we're working on. If we focus on this level 2, which is the product system level only, we're going to have problems because there's high level requirements, the operational level and the organizational level for both the customer and the developing organization that need to be taken into account. And they're drivers for what we come up with at the product system level. And then whatever we do at the product system level, we have an architecture defined, and then these flow down to the subsystem level and then lower level system elements. So the stakeholder real world expectations, lifecycle concept needs, and requirements exist at each of these levels. And stakeholders communicate their expectations in various forms, needs, requirements, use cases, user stories, operational scenarios. And then levels of architecture. Architecture is extremely important. When we're defining the architecture, we have our integrated set of needs. Those are then transformed into a set of design input requirements for the system of interest. Those are further then flow down or allocated to hardware, mechanical, software. There's going to be a lot of interactions between these, and then they're further sub-allocated, flow down. At some point, there's a line across between design inputs and design outputs. that we have to consider. So each element within the system architecture should have its own set of lifecycle concepts, integrated set of needs, and design input requirements. It's not something you just do once at the system level. We need to do this for each part of the architecture. The design outputs include design descriptions for each part or software functional module, as well as design output specifications to which the product will be manufactured or coded. And as an example, for a medical device, some of the groups I worked with are developing diagnostic systems. So they define an integrated set of needs for the diagnostic system. They have their set of design input requirements. And then their architecture, in this case, they have an instrument that's doing the diagnostics. They have an assay, which is being analyzed. And then they have software. And so then those are subdivided. So this is one example that we have for the medical device. So the level 1 diagnostic system requirements allocated to level 2. Each part develops its lifecycle concept, needs, and requirements, and the process continues until we cross the line and make the build code buy reuse decision. But a key thing is all these interactions, they involve interfaces, not only between each of these parts, the system itself, but between the organizations that are involved in each of these parts. In systems with embedded software, there's going to be a lot of dependencies and interactions with other parts. So the software can't be developed in a silo by itself because it's totally dependent upon the hardware which it's embedded. A key concept is traceability. The regulation requires developing organizations of medical devices to develop, maintain, and design history file that shall contain or reference the records necessary to demonstrate the design was developed in accordance with approved design plan requirements of the part. Traceability is a critical part of that. Failure to show traceability can lead to a product not being approved for its intended use. 13485 goes into more detail. The organization shall document procedures for traceability. These procedures shall define the extent of traceability in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements and the records to be maintained. So the design history file is one type of record. The traceability is really important. And so if you haven't planned ahead with traceability, you don't have the tools to maintain the traceability, it's going to be really hard to come up with the proper records that you need to submit to the FDA for acceptance of your product. We go into a lot more detail on traceability. And in fact, in first week of November, I'm giving the INCOSE monthly webinar is on traceability. So given the importance of traceability project success, many of the system engineering tools enable practitioners to define a traceability relationship meta model within the tool that enforce adherence to the model. You can look at this, you can see all the different types of data information that is developed across the lifecycle. This you're going to want to maintain within your tool set. And some of this may be in different tools, but they need to be able to share the data. You want to be able to provide linkage between this traceability. And then some of the tools, once you set up this model and you're defining the rules for traceability, the tools will actually notify you if you fail to meet one of the rules. Let's get into design input requirements as defined in the regulation. Say the physical and performance requirements of the device that are used as a basis for device design. So that gets into the concept of design inputs. You're going to base your design on the design inputs. So it says each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures to ensure that the design requirements, and they left out the word input, but they really meant the design input requirements relating to a device are appropriate and address the intended use of the device, including the needs of the user and patient. I expand user to all stakeholders, but they focus on the user. And the procedures shall include a mechanism for addressing incomplete, ambiguous, and conflicting requirements. And ISO 13485 says the requirements shall be complete, unambiguous, able to be verified, or validated, and not in conflict with each other. So a key thing is we're talking about design input requirements or design to what requirements. They don't contain the implementation. As I'll show a little bit later, the FDA doesn't use the word specification associated with design inputs. A lot of people talk about requirement specification as a design inputs. One thing, we do not use that term in the needs and requirements manual or the guide to writing requirements. We only use specification in terms of design output specifications. So we have design input requirements, design output specifications. But you can see that the FDA is concerned with the quality requirements, having the characteristics defined in the COSI Guide to Writing Requirements. So they only kind of touch on really at a high level the characteristics of well-formed requirements. In our products, we go into a lot more detail for that. So we have characteristics for individual requirement expressions that include what they say, but that we go into more detail, the necessary, appropriate, singular, correct, conforming. And then we have agreed to obligation, unambiguous, complete, feasible, and verifiable. These characteristics and rules, you can go to the INCOSE store and download for free our Guide to Writing Requirements summary sheet, which lists these characteristics and the rules for writing good requirements. We also have characteristics for well-formed sets of requirements, complete, consistent, correct, as well as feasible, comprehensible, able to be validated. So you can see where we go into a lot more detail on what we mean by well-formed individual needs and requirements and sets of needs and requirements. Now, the Guide to Writing Requirements goes into a lot more detail on this. For INCOSE members on our INET site, we have a complete set of presentations that talk about the Guide to Writing Requirements, basic concepts. It goes through the characteristics and it goes through the rules. And then we have other training material associated with actually applying the rules to requirement statements. So all that's available to INCOSE members on our INET site. So then we talk about design outputs, the result of a design effort at each design phase and at the end of the total design effort. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for defining and documenting the design output in terms that allow adequate evaluation of conformance to design input requirements. Well, I'll get to a little bit later, but this is what we call verification. So you have to have the design outputs in a form that they can be verified to meet the design inputs. Design output procedures shall contain or make reference to acceptance criteria and shall ensure that those design outputs are essential for proper functioning of the device are identified. Design output shall be documented, reviewed, and approved before release. And then they talk about, and specifically, the device master record. And I thought it was interesting when I saw the word essential, and that implies that there are probably design outputs and also design inputs that are not essential. When I talked about the attributes, I had an attribute that we defined for priority, but we also had an attribute for essential. What we define as an essential needed requirement is something that must be addressed, or you cannot meet your intended use, or you cannot mitigate the risk that you're talking about. So you can see that there's going to be requirements that are maybe high priority, but they're not essential. All essential are high priority. It's really important to make this clear. And I think from a change management standpoint, the FDA would be more interested in changes to essential needs and requirements. So we talk about requirements, specifications. Device master record is a compilation of records containing the procedures and specifications for a finished device. They use the word specification in the definition, and then they repeat the word specifications over and over again when they're talking about the device master record. So device specifications including drawings. So these are all design outputs that you're going to have. Production process specifications, how you're going to build the system. Quality assurance procedure specifications about the acceptance criteria. Package and labeling specifications. So again, I really like the idea that they differentiate specifications in this way. Some people use the word specification in place of requirement. Some people use specification in place of a document that contains requirements. We have design specifications. We have as-built specifications. You know, the word's used a lot without context. So in all of the requirement working group products, we make this distinction so there's no confusion. Design input requirements, design output specifications. So putting all this together, design inputs and design outputs. So we have the integrated set of needs to represent the needs of stakeholders, not just the users. When we talk about voice of the customer, I like to say VOX, voice of X, is all the different stakeholders. So we have the integrated set of needs and design input requirements. This process is not a waterfall, so to speak, like it could be implied here. There's feedback loops. This is really iterative, recursive process, knowledge based. As we learn more, as we move through the life cycle, means we may have to go back with that feedback and maybe update things that we defined earlier. When you look at the needs and requirements manual, you'll see that we're doing a lot of those activities that are discussed separately. We're doing those concurrently. Design inputs focus on design inputs, preliminary, logical, physical architectures, and then design outputs. We come up with the physical architecture, the design. Those are communicated via the design output specifications, which then through coding and building is our system element or medical device. The FDA puts out a supplemental document that provides guidance to product developers that go into a little bit more detail on the actual processes. And this is a key diagram that they explain. And so they clearly define that we have reviews throughout the life cycle. So we're going to review our user needs before we baseline them. We're going to review our design input requirements, the architecture design, our design output specifications, and we're going to have reviews of the actual product itself. And it makes clear verification is against the design input requirements and validation is against the user needs. They do not differentiate in the design process between architecture definition, design definition, while the INCOSE and 15288 have distinct architectural definition process and design process. So a little bit of difference there. And they really don't talk about the technical lifecycle stages defined in the INCOSE System Engineering Handbook. We do refer to these in the Needs and Requirements Manual. And so one of the things that we're doing in the guide is to map this to those lifecycle stages. So design reviews define a documented, comprehensive, systematic examination of a design to evaluate the adequacy of the design input requirements. And the word adequacy, I think we could expand into the quality and also the adequacy of the underlying analysis from which needs and design input requirements were transformed. Evaluate the capability of the design outputs to meet these requirements, identify any problems, and then each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures to ensure that the formal documented reviews of the design results are planned and conducted at the appropriate stages of the device's design development, so throughout the life cycle. The procedure shall ensure that participants at each design review include representatives of all functions concerned with the design stage being reviewed, and then the individuals who do not have direct responsibility for the design stage being reviewed, as well as any specialized needed. And so again, there's the multiple reviews, but they're all focused on, did you meet the design input requirements and did you meet the needs? So these are analogous in system engineering. We talk about gate reviews. The SR is the scope review, requirements review, a system review, preliminary design review, critical design reviews, integration readiness reviews. There could be a manufacturing readiness review. All these kind of reviews need to be planned. COSI defines a lot of these reviews by names like this. And so it's expected that the organizations would do the same as part of their design controls and their quality management system. And then you get into verification and design verification defined. One thing that I found interesting when going through Title 21.820, they have the definitions in one part of the regulation, and then they have the requirements in another. And I found it nice to combine the definitions with the requirements to better understand the intent of what they're talking about. So talk about verification means confirmation by examination, provision of objective evidence, specified requirements have been fulfilled. And the design verification, and I added and development because and development was added by ISO 13485 to this. So each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for verifying the device's design. Design verification confirms the design output meets the design input requirements. And there's also design verification, including identification of the design, methods, the date. Individuals performing verification shall be documented in the design history file. ISO 13485 doesn't go into detail about the names of the files, but they do say they're going to be documented. And I thought it was important, ISO 13485, they talk about if the intended use requires that the medical device be connected to or interface with other medical devices, verification, and later on they also include the same statement for validation, shall include confirmation that design outputs meet the design inputs when so connected and interfaced. So you've always got to take into account the macro system that your medical device is part of. Validation means confirmation by examination and provision of objective evidence that the particular requirements for a specified intended use can be consistently fulfilled. That's confusing when you're validating against requirements and verifying against requirements. So in our products, we talk about you're validating against the integrated set of needs. And that's confirmed when they talk about design validation, they actually say it means establishing objective evidence that the device specifications conform to user needs and intended uses, which is what our integrated set of needs defines. Each manufacturer shall establish and maintain procedures for validating the design. It's the validation that really is what your device is going to be accepted by. Design validation shall be performed under defined operating conditions of the initial units, lots, batches, and their equivalents. Design validation shall ensure devices conform to the defined user needs and intended uses, and shall include testing the production units under actual or simulated conditions. Design validation shall include software validation, risk analysis where appropriate, and users include all stakeholders that touch or interact with the system or output of the system in some way throughout the product lifecycle. So users is kind of a broader term, for a lot of different kinds of stakeholders. That's why I like to just, instead of saying users, they talk about stakeholders. When they talk about like VOC, voice of the customer, I talk about VOX, voice of all the stakeholders, both internal and external to our system being developed. And particular requirements for a specific intended use are what's referred to as the integrated set of needs. Process validation, establishing by objective evidence that a process consistently produces the result. So they're also very involved in the manufacturing coding process. You've seen a lot of problems, and especially some pharmaceuticals, that the output of their manufacturing system either is contaminated or becomes contaminated because some issue. So that implies a continuous quality function, assessing the quality of the outputs. We refer to this as production verification, and that's chapter 9 in the Needs and Requirements Manual. We have different process types, how to use it, how to develop it, how to manufacture it. So use is the instruction for use. Developing the device is all those design controls that I was talking about, and then manufacturing. Putting this all in context for verification validation. So we have the stakeholder real world expectations. Those are transformed into the integrated set of needs, transformed into the design input requirements. So these are design inputs. Then we have the design output specifications as a result of our architecture design definition activities. And then that's transformed into our realized system element. We're doing continuous validation. So we talk about requirements validation, design validation, system validation, and these are all against the needs. The needs are validated against the stakeholder real world expectations, which would be the real intended use. And then we have verification of both verifies that you built to spec, as well as verifying you meet the design input requirements. We're going to verify our design output specifications, reflect the design input requirements. And then we have these design controls that I talk about here. So we've got to verify that the organization followed your quality management requirements. And so needs requirements, verification, validation are the common threads that tie all system engineering lifecycle activities and artifacts together. Post-production verification validation. So we've added to this now, this last box. So once the system is put into operations, then the FDA is really concerned about maintaining post-production verification validation. We want to validate that we're still meeting the stakeholder real world expectations. But we also want to verify that we're still meeting the design input requirements and that we're following the procedures for operations of the system, the intended use, instructions for use, labeling. The FDA requires organizations to do this post-production verification validation, keep records and report issues and corrective actions, referred to as CAPA, corrective and preventive action. I recently saw a discussion, should we separate this into corrective action and preventive action? And I kind of think yes, because you really can't band-aid a system. The strength of the security of the system and safety of the system are defined in the architecture. Security, safety must be addressed at each lifecycle stage. It's not something you do just at the beginning. They've got to be part of the design controls, instructions to address safety and security throughout all those transformations that I talked about. And so, like from a security, safety standpoint, we should address misuse cases, loss scenarios. We need to address the off-nominal situations, and so that we build in the preventive actions as part of our capabilities and functionality of the system, rather than a band-aid at the end of when the system's already built. And then I talked about design controls, an important part here. That's one thing I've introduced into the needs and requirements manual and other products, that we're not just talking about the technical requirements. It's equally important that the process requirements be defined and that all organizations should have this. In some of my classes, I talk about the importance of nothing else about an organization keeping track of their lessons learned and documenting their best practices. As we're going through this, we have lessons learned, both good and bad, what works, what doesn't work. And we want to capture that corporate knowledge. And so organizations should be capturing what the best practices are for how they're going to do each of the activities. And they should be documenting those as part of their design controls. This is also an important aspect when you talk about processes for quality as well. People come and go in the organization. You don't want to lose that tribal knowledge. So again, documenting that information is very important. And then I won't go through this in detail. There's several different reports that have been defined. The design history file, key thing in there, they really want you to document, your needs, design input requirements. They want to see traceability. They want to see the results of verification validation as part of this. So we need to keep the records. And so you notice in that traceability file I had, all this information was included. So if we are maintaining our data properly with proper traceability, we should be able to almost create the design history file automatically from this. Design history record is containing more data. And then the device master record. So again, the whole thing is that record keeping is extremely important. We have to have a way to do this. The big point that we're making, going to digital engineering, model-based system engineering, is the need to move from a document-centric practice of system engineering to a data-centric practice of system engineering, so that all this data information is captured within an overall integrated federated model of our system of interest, as well as our system engineering artifacts. Let me real quickly look at some of the comments in our chat. What is preferred an MBSE term for specifications? Again, that's something that we're trying to get people to think about: design input requirements versus design output specifications. And specification does not imply document based. It can be included in a model. And that's some people's view. Again, I'd like to really make it clear, differentiate between what is a design input versus a design output. If I say design input specification, it's complicated. And the word specification can be used in different contexts. Some people will use the word specification in place of a requirement. Some people use specification in place of requirement document. Then we have design specifications. We have as-built specifications. The word is used a whole lot of different ways. A lot of people don't talk about the context, so it adds ambiguity. So someone said specification implies document, so kind of going out of usage anyway, since we're moving to document-based engineering. Good point, Ken. And then Beth talks about loss-driven capability-based analysis, focuses on essential, and then there's different names that Keith points out to essential. And essential meaning the same thing to FDA and INCOSE. I haven't seen a definition in Title 21, Part 820 or 1385 about what essential is. It seems like in other comments, some of the ISO standards do a better job of that. Essential performance is addressed in 606001. IEC TC62, we're clarifying better what essential performance is in the fourth edition that's being developed. So they're going to address that issue a little bit better. Is essential not implied in the term requirement? Not really. We have a whole lot of requirements that come from a whole lot of different sources. Some people say that all the requirements are the same priority, and I say no, they're not. If you're faced with a descope problem, you're going to find some requirements aren't as important as others. And so when you descope, you're going to say, well, we don't really need to meet these requirements. But the concept of essential, I think, is extremely important because it refers back to the way we define it is this is what you have to have. You can't meet the intended use. Without this, you just can't do it. Or without this, you're not going to be able to mitigate the risk that you identified at the beginning. And so you really can't do without those. So all essential are going to be priority one. But you're going to have business requirements like on branding and on colors and maybe some other things that are not essential, but they may be higher priority to the organization. So making that differentiation is useful for managing our system. And then when it comes to change control, what do you report? Reporting any change to essential, I think would be mandatory for the FDA. If it's not essential, low priority, maybe not. I'm not an expert in that area, but that's something that you can think about. And then we have the motivation for security and system security guides is that security SMEs and SOS SMEs can see themselves in the RWG documents. And so that's kind of the same reason why we want to develop a guide to medical device needs and requirements so we can kind of map that. Now, how do you distinguish the need between user needs validation and stakeholder validation? I don't differentiate that. The word validation and verification, when we talk about validation, verification of needs or requirements, we're talking about the quality of the needs and requirements. When we talk about verifying the system meets requirements or validating the system meets the needs, we're talking about system verification and validation as we define it in our products. So when you talk about system verification, you're always verifying against something. If you talk about system validation, you're always validating against something. So to get rid of the confusion, we're saying we're going to verify against the design input requirements. We're going to validate against the integrated set of needs, which represents, after a bunch of analysis, the stakeholder expectations for the system and the intended use. Again, I'm not validating stakeholders. I'm validating the integrated set of needs of the stakeholders. So terminology is really key. CAP is used to cover corrections and corrective actions, and preventive actions are separate activities. And that's good to separate that. And we need to make that clear. And Keith gives some examples. There's a good comment here that from Bryce that the FDA does have a separate document for guidance for software, but they emphasize defining an architecture. In reality, for embedded systems, during the design input phase, we define a functional architecture, and then in the design phase, we define a physical architecture. But overlaid on that is really a software architecture. So we have several different architectures that we have to define and manage. And there's a lot of dependencies between those architectures. When we talk about test and test phase and testing, it's not clear when you're doing testing whether you're debugging the system or the tests are associated with verification validation, because test is one method of verification validation. There are other methods. And when we're actually doing verification of the system, we're verifying against the design input requirements. When we're doing production verification, we're verifying the built system meets its design output specifications as built to print. And when we do validation, we're validating against the needs, which define our intended use. So when people talk about test phase and test procedures and automated testing, it's kind of ambiguous sometimes whether they're doing that as part of verification and validation or not. And you can see the FDA wants you to actually make clear that you are doing verification validation and you're maintaining certain data as a result of that. So that's something that I find some software organizations have a little bit of problem with that.
Sorry, asked about the difference between user needs and user requirements. The FDA sees them as the same.
I look at user needs and user requirements the same way as we define stakeholder needs and requirements. So during elicitation, some people will communicate their expectations in the form of, we need this. Some people will communicate their needs with the shall statement as requirements. Often those obtained during elicitation are incomplete, they're inconsistent, they're conflicting, they may not even be feasible. So we treat those as inputs. And then we address all those defects as part of our life cycle concepts analysis and maturation activities. Then out of that, then we define an integrated set of needs that is well formed, that does not have those defects. They are complete, consistent, correct, and feasible. And that's what we baseline as the scope. So as not to confuse verification validation against requirements, we say that we're validating against the integrated set of needs that have that underlying analysis. And we're verifying against the design input requirements that have that underlying analysis. Whereas a lot of times when I see user needs requirements document, they're defective. And if you go by the standards, the stakeholder requirements and user requirements are supposed to be well formed. So if I have a user requirement, the system shall, and if I have a design input requirement that says the system shall, I defy anyone to tell me the difference. They're both written on the system. So to me, that's extremely confusing. And so we try to be more clear in our terminology to try to reduce some of that ambiguity and confusion. Before we go into question and answers, I would like Keith to talk a little bit about the Guide to Medical Device Needs and Requirements Development Activities.
Yes, a few weeks ago, I came out with a discussion on the requirements working group on Viva Engage. Lou and I came to the conclusion that we needed to put together a version of needs and requirements for medical devices along the lines of the one that Keith has done for security, and we'll very much model on the approach taken there. We've got a small group of people involved. Well, if anyone's really interested, we don't want to have a big team on this, I should say. And really what I want to do is I'm going to take what Lou's done here in his presentation, base it around the framework of the equivalent document for security, probably be the lead author. So the idea is to keep it as a fairly small team, really just 4 people definitely committed to this, and one other person that I would think I would really want to involve. So probably at 5 people. We're hoping to get something out this year.
Like Keith said, we're going to start with a very small team to develop the initial draft, and then we'll announce on Viva Engage when it's ready for a review. And then we'll ask for reviewers, and then we'll provide a copy for the reviewers, a means for them to supply their comments, and then we'll address each of those comments. Because there's already a lot of standards out there, like we've referenced on defining essential or whatever, we're going to mention those by name, for people to refer to this for more detail, like a risk management program. The Needs and Requirements Manual talks about risk management in general, but it's an input into defining the lifecycle concepts and our needs. But there's already a lot of standards out there for medical device risk management, so we'll just refer to that. The same is true for other of the major standards. We'll refer to those too. We're not trying to redo those or replace those. Our main intent is to put this into the context of system engineering for medical devices. It's the activities that we talk about in the Needs and Requirements Manual. I noticed in some of the comments when people were introducing themselves that integrating systems engineering into their product development for some organizations is a challenge. In other organizations, they're attempting that. And hopefully the details that we have in this presentation will help people implement a system engineering perspective into their product development, because it does provide the foundation for all the data information that is required to be reported by the regulations and standards. Anyone have a question that they would like to come on air and ask? Any comments? I like this one comment. I just simply don't tell them I'm doing system engineering until it's too late for them. Interesting. And I say that there's a question here by Bruce. Do you have a mapping of ISO 1345 to ISO 15288? It's really not possible to do a mapping. As I talked about, 15288, its title is about lifecycle processes. It goes through a whole series of detailed processes across the lifecycle. 13485 and Title 21820 don't go into that detail. They're really focused more on the design inputs and design output part of it, and then various design reviews that go across that. So that's one of the reasons why we talked about having this guide, is to kind of do that mapping. One thing I see about Title 21.820 and 1345, the whole concept of quality management system seems to get overlooked. We do have technical support process, the System Engineering Handbook about quality management, but the degree that it's addressed for medical devices, to me, I think has some really good concepts that system engineering organizations for any type of product could benefit from. I've taken part of that in the needs and requirements manual and tried to at least touch on that a little bit. Okay, I guess if there's no further comments, Kevin, I think we can end this.
All right, I think that's a wrap. Thank you for your participation.